All right, let's dive into a company that everyone's heard of but probably doesn't fully understand, Monsanto.
Yeah, it's a company with a really interesting history and a lot of controversies, too.
So on this deep dive, we're going to get beyond those headlines and try to understand this company a little better.
It's going to be fun.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. I think most people know Monsanto for stuff like GMOs and pesticides, but what were they doing way back when they first started?
Well, Monsanto was actually founded all the way back in 1901.
Wow, that's way older than I thought. Okay, so what were they doing back then?
They were actually a chemical company, but not really agricultural chemicals,
Okay.
more like food additives.
Really?
Yeah, things like saccharin,
Okay.
caffeine,
Oh, interesting.
vanillin, that artificial vanilla flavoring. You might even have some in your pantry.
Wow. I did not realize that.
Yeah, so not pesticides right out of the gate.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did they go from like vanilla flavoring to being this huge agricultural company?
Well, over time, Monsanto started to expand into different types of chemicals.
Okay.
Industrial chemicals, things like that,
Right.
sulfuric acid, even PCBs.
Oh, PCBs. I
Yeah.
know those are bad, but what exactly are they again?
Yeah, they're polychlorinated biphenyls, a
Uh,
whole group of man-made chemicals, and they were actually used in a lot of different industries,
like what?
in electrical equipment,
Oh.
paints,
Hmm.
all sorts of industrial applications.
But I thought those were banned, right?
They were, yeah, in 1979 in the US.
Why?
Because they don't really break down in the environment,
Oh,
and
okay.
so they can accumulate in the food chain, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that can affect human health, wildlife, the whole thing.
Okay, so was Monsanto actually producing a lot of PCBs back then?
Yeah, before the ban, Monsanto was like the main supplier.
Really?
Like 99% of PCBs used in the US, that was from Monsanto.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like they were already involved in some pretty controversial stuff even in those early days.
Yeah, and it doesn't end there.
Oh no.
During World War II, they were actually involved in the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project, like the atomic bomb?
Exactly.
What were they doing?
Producing polonium.
What's that?
It's a crucial element for the detonators in the first nuclear weapons.
Wow. So they went from vanilla flavoring to the atomic bomb.
It is kind of a leap.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and it does make you wonder how that experience shaped their approach to science and technology later on.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know we can't talk about Monsanto without talking about Agent Orange. It's like the biggest controversy they've ever faced.
Yeah.
What exactly was their involvement in that?
So Agent Orange was a powerful herbicide, right?
Uh-huh.
And in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, Monsanto was one of the companies that produced it for the U.S. military.
And I know it was used to defoliate the jungles in Vietnam.
Right. Yeah, they wanted to disrupt enemy supply lines.
But it had these awful side effects for the people in the environment, didn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, there was this highly toxic chemical in it,
Oh, okay.
dioxin, and that caused a lot of problems, right?
Yeah, cancers, birth defects, really serious health problems.
And a lot of veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange ended up suing Monsanto, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
What happened with those lawsuits?
Well, in 1984, Monsanto and the other companies involved, they agreed to a settlement,
Okay.
$180 million to the veterans.
Wow. But they didn't admit any fault, right?
No, they didn't.
So it sounds like Agent Orange had a pretty big impact on Monsanto's reputation.
For sure. It raised a lot of questions about the ethics of their products and the potential risks involved. And it also kind of set the stage for future controversies, especially as they moved into genetically modified crops.
Right, GMOs. So that's what we're going to talk about next. How did Monsanto become such a leader in GMO technology? Well, starting in the 1980s, they really started to focus heavily on agricultural biotechnology.
Okay.
And in 1983, they actually achieved something pretty amazing.
What was that?
They were one of the first to genetically modify a plant cell.
Wow. Okay, so this is where things get really interesting.
And just a few years later, they were doing the first field trials of these genetically modified crops.
What were some of their biggest innovations in GMOs?
Well, probably their most well-known one was Roundup-Ready crops.
Okay, I've heard of those. What are they exactly?
So these crops were genetically engineered to be resistant to glyphosate.
Glyphosate.
Yeah, that's the active ingredient in Roundup, their herbicide.
Okay.
So farmers could spray their fields with Roundup, and it would kill the weeds but not harm their crops.
I see. So that sounds like it would be a big advantage for farmers.
Yeah, the idea was to make weed control simpler, boost those crop yields, And it was really popular. I mean, by the mid-2000s, like over 80% of soybeans planted in the U.S., they were Roundup ready.
Wow, that's amazing. But I remember hearing a lot about Monsanto's patents on these seeds. Was there a controversy around that?
Yeah, Monsanto held patents on their genetically modified seeds, so they had a lot of control over who could grow them and how they were produced.
So what happened? Did those patents eventually expire?
The key ones for Roundup Ready soybeans, those did expire.
Okay.
One in 2011, the other in 2014.
So what did that mean for farmers? Could they start saving their seeds and replanting them?
Not really, no. Most seed companies still have those contracts with farmers
Okay.
that prevent them from doing that.
Okay.
But the expiration did create more competition in the market because other companies could start incorporating the glyphosate resistance into their own seeds.
I see. So it was a big change for the industry.
It was.
But Roundup Ready crops, that wasn't their only innovation, right? Didn't they have other types of GMOs as well?
Right. They also developed Brita crops.
What are those?
So these are crops that are genetically modified to produce their own insecticide. So it helps to protect them from pests.
I see. So they don't need to use as many pesticides.
That's the idea.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then they also pioneered what they call stacked traits.
What does that mean?
So that's when they combine multiple genetic modifications in a single plant.
Okay.
So you might have herbicide resistance and pest resistance all in one.
Wow. It sounds like they were really at the forefront of agricultural technology.
They were, but with all this innovation came a lot of fear and controversy. I mean, think about those stories about Terminator seeds.
Oh, yeah, Terminator seeds. It
Yeah.
sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. What were those all about?
So the official name for that was genetic use restriction technology,
Okay.
or GRT for short.
GRT.
And the idea was to create seeds that would produce sterile plants.
Really?
So farmers couldn't save those seeds and replant them the next year. They would have to buy new seeds every time.
I could see why people would be worried about that. Did Monsanto actually try to sell these Terminator seeds?
No, they never commercialized them. They did invest in research in the 1990s, and they filed some patents, but there's a huge public outcry.
Oh, I bet. It sounds pretty scary.
There were protests, and people were really worried about the impact it would have,
Yeah.
especially on farmers in developing countries.
Right, who rely on saving seeds.
Exactly. So in 1999, Monsanto pledged that they wouldn't commercialize it. And those patents, they've actually expired now.
So it never really went beyond the research stage.
Yeah, it was more of a what if than a reality.
Okay, so moving on to another major controversy, Roundup. I know this is the one that's caused the most legal trouble for Monsanto. What's the science behind all that?
Well, the whole debate centers around glyphosate, right? That's the key ingredient in Roundup.
Okay.
For a long time, it was considered a pretty safe herbicide. And a lot of regulatory agencies, including the EPA here in the U.S., they didn't find any solid evidence that it caused cancer in humans.
That there was that report that said it might cause cancer, right?
Yeah, that was from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC.
And they were part of the World Health Organization, right?
Yeah. And in 2015, they classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans.
So what was that based on?
They looked at a bunch of studies and saw a potential link between glyphosate exposure and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is a type of cancer.
So did that lead to those lawsuits against Monsanto?
It did. I mean, after that report came out, tons of people who had developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma after using Roundup, they started filing lawsuits.
And they were saying that Monsanto should have known about the risks and warned people.
Exactly.
So what happened with those lawsuits? Did any of them actually win?
Some of them did, yeah. There was one really high-profile case, Dwayne Johnson.
I think I remember hearing about that one.
He was a groundskeeper in California, and he developed terminal non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Oh, that's awful.
And in 2018, a jury awarded him $289 million in damages.
Wow.
They said that Monsanto acted with malice, that they didn't warn him about the risks. That award was later reduced on appeal, but the verdict still stood.
So that means that a jury actually found that Roundup was responsible for his cancer.
Right, it was a landmark case.
Wow. And were there other cases like that?
Yeah, another notable one was Edwin Hardeman.
Okay.
He also had non-Hodgkin lymphoma after using Roundup, and in 2019, a jury found Monsanto liable for his cancer too.
Wow. And how much did they have to pay him?
$80 million in damages.
So Monsanto was really starting to feel the heat from all these lawsuits, weren't they?
Yeah, and then there was another big one in 2019.
What was that one?
This one was against Bayer.
Bayer.
Yeah, they had just acquired Monsanto in 2018.
Oh, right.
And a jury ordered Bayer to pay $2 billion in damages to a couple who said Roundup caused their non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Wow, $2 billion. That's a lot.
It is, and that one was also reduced on appeal, but still it was a huge amount.
So did all these lawsuits make Monsanto change their stance on the safety of Roundup?
Not publicly, no. Throughout all of this, Monsanto and later Bayer, they kept saying that Roundup was safe when used correctly. And they argued that there wasn't really a scientific consensus on glyphosate causing cancer.
So they were basically saying that the IRC was wrong.
Yeah, they said it was an outlier and that most regulatory agencies had found glyphosate wasn't a cancer risk.
So it's kind of like a he said, she said situation, I guess.
Yeah, it left a lot of people confused about who to believe.
And it must have been a major problem for their business, right?
Absolutely.
So did Bayer eventually just settle all these lawsuits?
They did. In 2020, Bayer agreed to a settlement worth over $10 billion to resolve more than 100,000 Roundup cancer lawsuits in the U.S.
Wow, that's incredible. So that put an end to the whole Roundup controversy, right?
It resolved a lot of the existing lawsuits, but the debate around Roundup is still going on, and new lawsuits are still being filed.
It sounds like this story is far from over. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back to talk about Monsanto's legacy and what happened after the Bayer acquisition. Before we move on to Monsanto's legacy, I wanted to touch on something that came up during the break. Dicamba, another one of their herbicides.
Yeah.
There were some controversies around that too, right?
Yeah, dicamba, that was part of their Extend crop system.
Okay, what was that?
So these were seeds that were genetically engineered to be resistant to both glyphosate and dicamba.
Okay, so it's like Roundup ready, but with extra protection.
Exactly.
So what was the issue with that?
The problem is dicamba, it can be really volatile.
Volatile?
It evaporates easily and it can drift in the wind.
Oh, so it can spread to other fields.
Yeah, and that's what happened.
What happened?
Farmers started complaining that dicamba was drifting from neighboring fields and it was hurting their crops, especially the ones that weren't dicamba resistant.
So their crops were being damaged by this herbicide even though they weren't using it.
Right, it was a big problem. I mean, there were millions of acres of farmland affected.
Wow.
And a lot of those farmers sued.
They sued Monsanto.
Monsanto and BASF.
Oh, why?
BASF.
They also produced dicamba-based herbicides.
Okay, so what happened with those lawsuits?
There was one early trial. A peach farmer in Missouri, his orchard was destroyed by dicamba drift.
Oh, that's terrible.
And in 2020, a jury found Monsanto and BASF liable for negligence
Okay.
because they didn't warn farmers about the risks of this drift.
Wow. And did the farmer win?
He did, yeah. The jury awarded him $265 million in damages.
Wow, that's a lot.
It was a big win for him. And after that, the EPA, they started putting restrictions on how dicamba could be used.
Okay.
Bayer also tried to tweak their dicamba formulations.
To make them less volatile.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing that didn't really solve the problem.
Not completely. There's still a lot of controversy surrounding dicamba.
So it sounds like Monsanto just kept running into these issues with their products.
It did, and it really brings up this question of their legacy, you know?
Yeah, it's a complicated legacy for sure. On the one hand, they were pioneers in agricultural technology, right?
Definitely, especially with GMOs.
Right.
I mean, they had a huge impact on agriculture worldwide. Increased crop yields, helped reduce the need for pesticides in some cases.
That's a really important point. It's not all negative.
Right. But then you have all these controversies and concerns about their practices and the potential risks of their products.
Right.
You know, Monsanto became kind of a symbol of corporate greed, environmental damage, the dangers of unchecked technology in agriculture.
Yeah.
People accuse them of putting profits ahead of everything else.
Of not caring about people or the planet.
Right. Silencing their critics, wielding too much influence over regulators. There's a lot to unpack there.
So what happened to Monsanto in the end? I know Bayer bought them, right?
Yeah, that was in 2018. Bayer acquired Monsanto for a whopping $66 billion.
Oh, wow, that's a huge deal. And then they got rid of the Monsanto name, right?
They did, shortly after the acquisition.
Which makes sense given all the negative baggage.
Yeah, it was definitely a PR move to distance themselves from all the controversy. But the merger itself has also had its own problems.
Like what?
Well, remember all those Roundup lawsuits?
Yeah.
Bayer inherited all of those when they bought Monsanto.
Oh, I bet that wasn't fun.
Not at all. I mean, Bayer's stock price plummeted. They had tons of pressure from investors, from the public, the whole thing. Some analysts even call it one of the worst corporate mergers in history.
Wow. So what's next for Bayer? How do they move on from all of this?
That's the big question. They've said they're committed to sustainability and responsible innovation, but they need to actually prove it.
What would that look like?
Well, for one, they need to be more transparent. They need to talk openly with farmers, with consumers, with regulators, and they need to invest in research that focuses on truly sustainable solutions.
Boy, like what kinds of solutions?
Solutions that help us reduce reliance on herbicides,
Okay.
crops that are more resistant to climate change, things like that.
So it sounds like they have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust.
They do. It's going to be a big test for them, not just for their business, but ethically, morally, the whole thing.
It's definitely a story that people are going to be watching closely. So what can our listeners do to stay informed about all of this? How can they make sure the food they're eating is being produced in a responsible way?
Well, I think the most important thing is to keep learning and to keep asking questions.
Okay, so don't just accept what you hear.
Right. Dig deeper. Look at different perspectives. Challenge those assumptions. Support organizations that are working towards a more sustainable food system.
Okay.
And hold these corporations accountable for their actions. Your choices as a consumer, they really do matter.
That's a good point.
Well,
And I think it's important to remember that Monsanto's story, as messy as it is, it's just one part of this much bigger picture.
yeah.
The evolution of agriculture,
Mm.
the challenges of feeding a growing population, and doing it in a way that's sustainable and fair.
Exactly. And this is a conversation that needs to continue. We all need to be a part of shaping the future of food and farming.
Absolutely. We're going to take a short break to gather our thoughts, and then we'll be back with some final questions for our listeners. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into Monsanto. It's been a wild ride, for sure. From vanilla flavoring to Agent Orange to GMOs, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, it's a company with a really complex history. A lot of innovation, but a lot of controversy too.
So as we wrap things up, let's look ahead. What's the future of agriculture? What are some of the big trends and challenges that we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, no question, is climate change.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. But how exactly is climate change affecting agriculture?
In a lot of ways, actually. I mean, we're seeing more extreme weather, droughts, floods, shifting growing seasons. It's already having a big impact.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about coffee.
Coffee.
Yeah. Coffee farmers, they're already being hit hard by rising temperatures and changes in rainfall. It's affecting the quality of the beans, the yields are going down, and that means higher prices for us.
Wow, I didn't realize it was already having such a direct impact.
Yeah, and it's not just coffee. We're seeing similar problems with staple crops, too.
Like what?
Wheat, corn, soybeans, things that people rely on all over the world.
Okay, so this is a big problem. What can we do about it?
Well, there are a lot of things we can do. One is to develop crops that are more resistant to climate change.
What does that mean?
Crops that can withstand higher temperatures, drought, things like that.
Is anyone working on that?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of research going on in that area. Scientists are using traditional breeding methods and also new technologies like gene editing.
To create these climate-resilient crops.
Exactly. And another important approach is sustainable farming practices.
Okay, like what?
Things like no-till farming, cover cropping, crop rotation.
What do those do?
They help to conserve water, improve the health of the soil, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's about making farms more resilient and less harmful to the environment.
So it's about farming smarter. I'm also curious about the role of technology. We've talked about how technology has played a big role in Monsanto's story, and it seems like technology could also be part of the solution here. What are some of the technological innovations that could help us address these challenges?
Yeah, technology is definitely going to be a big part of the solution. One area that's really promising is precision agriculture.
What's that?
It's about using sensors, data analytics, things like that to optimize farming practices, like being really precise about how much fertilizer you use, how much water you use, so you're not wasting resources.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and then there's vertical farming.
Oh, vertical farming. I've seen pictures of those. They look super cool.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing. You're growing crops in these stacked layers, often indoors, using artificial lighting and hydroponics or aeroponics.
So you can grow food anywhere, even in a city.
Exactly. You can control the environment, grow food year-round, use less water, less pesticides.
Sounds pretty futuristic.
It is, and I think it has the potential to change the way we think about food production.
That's really exciting. So it sounds like we have some promising solutions, but obviously there are still challenges ahead.
Mm.
As we navigate all of this, what are some things that we should keep in mind?
Well, I think the key is to think holistically. We need to look at the whole food system, from how it's grown to how it's consumed, and we need to think about the impact of our choices on the environment, on human health, on social equity.
That's a good point. It's about more than just profits and efficiency.
Exactly. We need a food system that's sustainable for the planet and fair for everyone.
I think Monsanto's story, with all its ups and downs, offers some important lessons for us. We've seen how powerful technology can be, but we've also seen the potential downsides when it's not used responsibly.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to be thoughtful and careful about how we develop and use these technologies, and that we need to be transparent and accountable for the choices that we make.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue to explore these issues and ask questions. The future of agriculture really is in all of our hands.
That's right. It's a conversation that we all need to be a part of.
Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.